So the first speaker we have, we're really lucky to have, is Professor Elena Simperl, and she's with the Department of Informatics here at King's College London, and she's going to speak to us today about introduction to AI and its societal challenges. So over to you, Elena.
All right, how much time do I have?
About 10 to 15.
Oh, that's fabulous. Good morning. I made some notes because I thought on a Saturday morning, I don't know how awake I'm going to be and how clear my mind. So whatever I say, do challenges because I can't trust myself at this time of day of the Saturday. So yes, so I'm in computer science. I'm an AI scientist. I've been an AI scientist my whole life. And I'm just going to give you a very personal introduction of what AI is and isn't. So when I have this sort of conversations about AI these days, with everything that you read about it in the media and elsewhere, I find it quite useful to use a very dry definition of what an AI system is or isn't. And the definition I'm going to use today comes from OECD. So you've heard about OECD. Among other things, they have working groups, multi-stakeholder working groups to discuss challenges in AI and emerging technologies. So what do they say? They say an AI system is a machine-based system. So that's a piece of software that for explicit or implicit objectives infers from the input it receives how to generate outputs such as predictions, content, recommendations, or decisions that can influence physical or virtual environments. Nothing in this definition says it's intelligent, is going to take over the world, it is meant to replace humans. It also doesn't talk about what artificial is versus natural or other types of objectives, yeah? So as far as I'm concerned, the term in itself is historical. It's been around for 50, 60 years. Those of you interested in the history of science, I'll be around after the panel as well, and we can have a chat about this. But it is a piece of software that operates like every other IT systems you've ever used. It makes mistakes, and when it makes mistakes, you don't look at it and think and assign it some sort of human it is trying to deceive me, it is trying to manipulate me. Now it makes mistakes because it is a computer system. You trust it like you would trust a computer system. Yeah, so when it does something amazing, you don't think, oh, there is a genie in the bottle. You think, oh yeah, it does what it was supposed to do, and I wasn't actually aware it can do this. Think about it as a calculator that does amazing things. If a calculator makes a mistake, you're not going to think, well, someone's trying to sell me the wrong type of calculator. Just think, either it's broken, I need to buy a new one, or whoever built it made a mistake. So that's the framework for it. Why do we call it AI? Well, because some of these tasks that we use it for today, in terms of predicting things and, I don't know, composing songs and coming up with suggestions for recipes or writing an essay, our information processing tasks, they're quite complex. And in the past, we thought it was impossible that we would get to the level of information processing technology and automation to be able to support these tasks in any meaningful way. But things have changed quite a bit in the last 10, 15 years. AI scientists and engineers have access to lots of data, and we can talk a lot about that data and who should have access to it and how should it be used ethically. But the fact is, we do have access to way more data than ever before. We also have access to computer infrastructure, very powerful computer infrastructure. Again, we can talk about who has access or should have access to it and what the environmental costs about that, but we do have access. So, and with these two resources, data and computer infrastructure, we have found ways to use them in ingenious ways to indeed build tools, software, that can predict, recommend, assist, and do all these things that in the past were much harder to do. because we had access to much less data, and our computers with the processing units in them, with the servers and so on and so forth, were not as readily accessible. This type of AI that you've seen popping up since November 2022, so the ChatGPTs of the world, has been around for a long, long time. Every time you do a web search now, but even before 2022, you are using, or Google and the other search engine providers were using very similar types of technologies. The reason they were able to use that sort of machine learning was because they have access to lots of data that they were collecting online, all the queries that that people type in, all the personal data you share with that information. Your movie recommender, again, has access to databases of what people view, what people like, plus some general information about what movies are and their directors and sort of important information. And they were doing those sort of recommendations where sometimes you were thinking, wow, how did it find that? And equally, they were providing suggestions where you were thinking, actually, keeps on suggesting rom-coms after I've just seen Pretty Woman, yeah? That has been around for a very, very long time. Many other examples. Your spam filter, quite complex AI. Your autocomplete on your phone when you write a message. I don't know, your social media feed and the way it is curated. Alexa, exactly the same type of AI. So what has changed? What has changed is that we have a different way to interact with AI. All of a sudden, through these sort of conversational chatbot-like interfaces, you could instruct that technology to do various things. In the past, the AI that was or is sitting behind the search engine or your autocomplete on your phone was a much more specific, narrow model, still very, very sophisticated, but it was built for that purpose. That meant it needed less data, it was cheaper to build, and so on and so forth. Lots of interesting attributes in engineering, but it was built for that purpose. If you wanted if you wanted it to do something else, so take something that was meant to detect spam in your email, now use it for autocomplete, it wasn't straightforward. Yeah, you had to retrain it, you had to collect data, you had to do all sorts of things. These new models, because they've been trained on way more data and hence are much more expensive to build, they are general models, not general AI, yeah, just general foundational models that you can repurpose them. And that's why you can instruct ChatGPT to do all sorts of things and it will do that. What else has changed? Well, these sort of models, not everyone can build them. You need lots and lots of data, and there's only that many things you could do to collect that data in ethical and legal ways. So it encourages a certain type of behavior, and at some point when there is no more data, the question is what happens next? And they're very expensive to build. So there's very few entities which can afford to build this technology. And we can discuss what the consequences. Availability of this chatbot interface, right? So you talk to an AI, you tell him all sorts of things, you argue with it. So the way people perceive what this machine-based system is and isn't, and what they project on it is different, right? Now, someone also made a decision to allow this machine-based system to sound supremely confident about all sorts of things, which changes how and how much we trust that technology. But you've also noticed already that it makes lots of mistakes, right? So one thing that it does is availability of up-to-date information. And this changes with new releases, but it is very much dependent on the data that was fed into that system. So if all the data is from 2021, nothing that is from 2022, for instance, will be available. What else? Anything related to numbers, for instance. So if you ask ChatGPT or all the lookalikes to, let me see if I get this right, multiply a number by 1.8 and add 32. It is fairly likely that it will give you the right result and you'll think, oh, wow, yeah? Try any other mathematical equation and it will not do that. Why is that? Because that's the formula that you turn temperatures from Fahrenheit to Celsius or the other way around. Yeah, so somewhere online, there were pages about the temperatures and these 2 units of measurements. ChatGPT doesn't know how to do arithmetics. You could build additional modules on training it to do that, but it slows things down because someone has to type those rules in and so on and so forth, yeah? It just happens to learn patterns that it sees often. Equally, any type of request that requires knowledge that is not readily available, including some in languages that are perhaps not so present online and so on and so forth, is likely to be less helpful. So then the question is, how do we want to build this technology so that you can rely on it in an appropriate way, so that you know when to trust it, just like with your calculator? So I'm going to finish. For me, I mean, I've worked in AI, I've built systems like this. I know how they're built. I know the engineers who built them. AI is a dual technology. You can use it for many purposes. We know of past uses of AI, we know of current ones and planned ones. Some of them are beneficial, some are a bit murkier, some are just bad. The bottom line is we need to know of them, and we need, as individuals and collectively, and our governments and decision makers, we need to have a way to know what is going on, to be able to audit the systems and to scrutinize them. That's not, for me, that's not so much a technology question, though there are ways in which you can make this sort of scrutiny really easy or easier, or really hard. But you need to be able to understand, to know when to rely on your calculator and when not. The second thing, you need to be able to redress, have mechanisms to redress when things go wrong, and for everyone to understand their rights and what they can do, and for engineers equally to have means and a level of literacy to be aware of these sort of limitations and have built-in mechanisms to change things. Finally, there is a question of, at least for me, how benefits are spread. So I work in science. The work that we do is open source, almost by default. The data that goes into the systems, there's a whole conversation, and maybe colleagues will talk about the rights of people and artists and others, and the degree to which those rights were taken into account or broken when that data was collected. But also because of the amount of resources it takes to build this sort of technology from scratch. There's a conversation, at least for me personally, around how to spread the benefits of the technology more equitably. And I think that's it. I'll leave it at that. I can tell you a bit more about research if anyone's interested, but I'm sure my colleagues have interesting things to say as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So everyone, do think of questions. We'll do a Q&A at the end. We have some time for that, but obviously the more you can come up with great questions, then the quicker we'll be able to go through them. So do think about that and I'll collect them afterwards. So now I'd like to ask Rachel Coldicutt from Careful Industries and Promising Trouble. She's the executive director of those groups, to talk about AI, the tech community and ethics. So you have some slides.
Right, yes.
Masters. Yes, you can. We've got, yeah.
Talk very loudly. And we are, I'm assuming I just go like this. No, I don't. Oh, can I, is that okay? I'll just press it if that's right. Well, I think actually it's really nice. I have a good follow on, but I'm maybe taking us in a slightly different direction. I'm not going to spoil it. I won't. Lovely. Thank you. I know I've been really annoying because I haven't done the slides, but to the Saturday morning point, and wake everybody up. So. Thank you. Oh, amazing. Great. Right. So I'm Rachel. I've been working on the internet for a long time, since 1995, when it wasn't really a job and people sort of looked at you slightly weirdly. And because of that, I accidentally worked in R&D for about 20 years, and then policy since about 2015. And what I do now is I run an independent research organisation. And we do lots of work actively understanding how technology is changing the world in the here and now. We do lots of work with, on the one hand, government, corporates, but we pilot and make our own things to show how it could work otherwise. And one of the things we're really interested in is it possible, even in the moment we're in now, to sort of turn AI around from being a technology that absorbs and intensifies power, something that is more generally beneficial. We even have t-shirts, buy a t-shirt, because it feels like AI particularly attracts a lot of myth and a lot, it's quite hard to understand, and I'll be talking about that in a moment. And I'm gonna begin with people too young to have seen the first Jurassic Park movie, again. So this is Ian Malcolm, who's a chaos theorist in the first film, and he says, a variant of just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. And we are very much living through that moment, I think, right now. And so lots of the work that we do is about how to activate communities to bring them community power. I previously done quite a lot of work on government and regulatory mechanisms to regulate. But we're in a moment very much where the speeds of things are not moving in a way that means legislative and particularly multilateral agreements are working at a rate that is particularly useful. We need more things to happen more organically on the ground. And I think this is a challenge for everyone, right? It's very easy to sort of say these things are hard to understand, they're happening and removed. This is not for me or for us, but actually I think this is something that we can come together in many ways to resist and shape and change. Because one of the things that happens with technologies, and one of the things I think that happened in 2022 is change, Elena was talking about lots of the technologies that came on the scene at the end of 2022 had been around for a long time. But they reached a tipping point of critical mass over the last year. And I think when things are at that moment, they feel hard to intervene in, but actually there are many signs and signals that unfold earlier. And one of the things, is anyone in the room an AI ethics specialist? I'm about to be a bit rude. Okay, right. Sorry. Right. So basically, I've been working in the field since about 2015, and it feels to me that there are two words that are brought together to make it difficult for people to understand what is actually happening. So AI refers to lots and lots and lots of things, right? From the very simplistic, such as putting a tap filter on your face in Snap or Insta, to targeting bombs, right? The idea that we're using a word to talk about all those other things is sort of ridiculous. And in 2022, the Georgetown Privacy Centre said they were no longer going to use the word, right? They were going to break it down, talk about machine learning, talk about LLMs, and be much more specific. Likewise, ethics, very easy to think that ethics is an objective universal code. But really, particularly in business and in government, ethics very often become contextual, which means we need better rules. And I think I've got too much to talk about, so I'm going to start going really fast. So if it doesn't make any sense, I'm sorry. So what I want to focus on is whether it's possible for the general purpose AI, and so the sorts of things that Elena was talking about, and that can be tools to do other things. Is it possible for them to do no harm? And I think it's what quite often happens, we approach that from a technical lens, but actually it's a social issue. I think Elena has already introduced us to this, but in the AI Act, there's the definition of the general purpose AI, which is basically describing it's describing tools, so the tools that are made to do all sorts of things that can be repurposed easily. The last time I think we really saw general purpose technology appear was social media. So it's like back in the late 90s when I was working at the BBC, we talked about user generated content. Nobody really thought or anticipated that being able to upload information to the internet would turn into political influencing, the scaling of business, the way that relationships have totally changed. And so that happened in like 20 years. And potentially AI will make certain changes faster. So these are the kinds of tools we're talking about when we're talking about the general purpose AI. They're not all generative, but some of them are. And they're made to learn and to change. And just this week, we've seen the kinds of things they can easily learn to change to do, right? I think very often, automated systems drive to the bottom, like very fast, right? They aren't here to create content about the best and most noble things in the world, right? Unfortunately, people have made a lot of bad things and put them on the internet. And, these are the kinds of outputs that come from that. It's not all about content, but it's a good example of the kinds of things that technology can learn. I want to talk very quickly about content, because technologies that we use aren't happening in a bubble, they're happening in the world. And that we are, this is a time of enormous volatility and change. I don't think I need to talk about that. I think we know a lot of bad things are happening. But actually, we're equally at a time when the rule of law and international courts are not really working in warfare. And so on the one hand, we've got very nice meetings of the OECD and UN coming up with rules for international governance and AI. And then we basically have people saying, I'm not really interested in rules. I'm doing whatever I like. So, this is an issue. How long do I have?
About 2 to 5.
Great, okay, so. One of the things that is not super obvious, I think, particularly when we're looking at consumer tech, is that defence interests are at the heart of most digital technologies. You know, it's how they were born, how they were created. And the boundaries are totally blurred. There are gaming companies with multi-million-pound market caps who are making digital twins that are used in defence. You know, what you're doing in Call of Duty is maybe not a million miles away from what's happening on the ground. And so we don't really have the lines of separation that we expect in other parts of life with tech. You know, as can be seen by the fact that Google Maps exists to highlight where the traffic, and this is a military technology originally. GPS mapping is a military tool that became the general purpose tool that is now being used for surveillance. Likewise, you know, last week I had to mend my boiler, and I looked up how to do it on YouTube. If you're in the Ukraine at the moment, you may be looking at how to take over a tank, right? The technologies that we have are used in lots of different ways that we can't really think about. So I'm going to wrap up. I think the answer, can we aim to do no harm, is no. Right, and so if we can't aim to do no harm, what do we do instead? And I think there is a huge role to talk more, do more, protest more. I have a whole other very nice talk about the social, political, economic levers that we as communities have to make a change. Don't obviously have time to talk about that now. But protest, organising, acting together. There's an amazing initiative at the moment, Eat Sims for Gaza, which is bringing together people to donate the Sims in areas where the comms infrastructure has been taken away. You know, there are lots of informal routes to organise and to make different things happen. So really, I think the problem is not AI, the problem is people. And well, if you can sort people out, it goes away. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rachel. And again, please have a think about questions to ask the panel, because I'd rather you ask the questions than I did. I have questions, of course I have questions, but I'd rather hear your questions because it's your conference, it's for you. So yeah, have a think. And that goes for you too online. I haven't forgotten about you. I'm watching you. Okay, great. So next is Dr. Matt Mahmoudi, who's a researcher and advisor with Amnesty International, and he works on tech, big data, artificial intelligence and human rights. So that's what he'll be talking about for us today. So Matt, please, over to you.
Wonderful. Firstly, we take the opportunity to thank Tim Street and the British Pugwash for inviting me along to today's event. Needless to say that I'm a little bit starstruck being on this panel. So thanks for letting me join y'all. I think it's more important than ever that young professionals, spanning scientists, social scientists, activists, ethicists, conceptualize a shared vernacular through which to escalate a general awareness of the manifold ways in which AI systems are harming the most marginalized communities. This is parts of what Rachel was talking about as well. I think, as we know, these are not harms that have sort of appeared overnight, as the discourse was to a large extent, I think, hijacked by long-termist ideologies and tech corporations themselves as generative AI moved into a mainstream space about a year and a half ago. Rather, I'd say the cumulative buildup of harms leading us down the path of a steady but opaque erosion of our human rights through permissive environments that are generated simply by our quotidian acceptance of certain deployments and developments of artificial intelligence as inevitable. And this has been a long time in the making, and I want to challenge that inevitability a little bit in the discussion today. So starting with addressing some of the human rights harms that come from artificial intelligence systems and rooting us in the basis of international human rights law. I think it's more urgent than ever to get ahead of some of the long documented human rights risks associated with the development and deployment of artificial intelligence systems. I'm going to focus this intervention a little bit on algorithmic racism in particular, from mundane everyday applications of these technologies to policing contexts, to conflict and warfare as well. You see, at Amnesty, we believe that some of these technologies are deeply embedded in institutional discrimination and contain technical biases that put us on a dangerous path towards the automation of the erosion of our most basic human rights, and especially for marginalized communities, historically marginalized communities, Black and brown communities around the world. You will have heard discourse around facial recognition technologies in particular. And I want to start with that, and then we can zoom out to what that means on a broader systemic level. I'm concerned with facial recognition technologies for identification and mass surveillance in particular. The technology, as we know, has been sort of on the rise globally over the last 10, 15 years, and poses a range of unique risks to international human rights simply by design. So we don't even have to get into how it's being applied. And it includes in high-stakes scenarios such as for law enforcement, and there's a growing impact on human rights worldwide that we can get into. We know that it's being used to intentionally target certain individuals and groups of people based on characteristics including ethnicity, race, and gender, without individualized, reasonable suspicion of criminal wrongdoing. In our own research in Amnesty, we've shown how Black and brown people are asymmetrically targeted by the technology, even at the point of deployment. So without it actually having been used yet, you're more likely to find CCTV cameras that are enabled with facial recognition technology in areas that have more communities of Black and brown people and more poor communities walled in by these technologies than you are in more affluent areas. And you're also more likely to see that people who are targeted by stop and frisk policing practices also end up in facial recognition databases and end up having sort of that noxious feedback loop repeating itself. Leaving the racial discrimination angle for the time being, facial recognition technologies also instill a chilling effect, meaning that communities are deterred from exercising their right to protest, to freedom of expression and peaceful assembly, out of fear that they're going to be surveilled and persecuted and penalized simply for exercising their basic rights. And we can't have this, right? The right to protest is an essential right for a healthy and free society. And so in the absence of being able to exercise your rights without fear of surveillance, you end up on a very slippery slope. And so there's a question around compatibility of these systems with international human rights law in general, with international law in general. And to be blunt, we've sort of determined, along with 250 other civil society organizations, that facial recognition systems are incompatible with international human rights law by design. And we've called for the complete ban on facial recognition technologies that enable mass and discriminatory surveillance. And this comes because, again, the technology categorizes people based on predictive characteristics such as race and gender. And it also comes on the back of how it stands to violate, three fundamental rights that we've alluded to previously. So one is the right to privacy. The technology actually depends on the mass scale scraping and downloading of people's images without their knowledge and consent, often from social media profiles, often from driver's license databases. There are no real clear understanding on how this happens, but it happens typically without knowledge and consent. That reference database is necessary in order for the facial recognition tool to actually work. And so even before the tool has been used, it's had to engage in a violation of your right to privacy. And then secondly, there is the element of your right to equality and non-discrimination. Talked about before how the tools are being deployed around areas that have more Black and brown people. But as we also know from the groundbreaking work of Timnit Gebru and Joy Bolanguini, the ways that the data sets that actually train the facial recognition algorithms are constructed and used, these images are curated predominantly with white male faces. And so you end up in a scenario in which there is a lot of false positives. Some studies indicate 35%, some studies indicate 60%. There are studies that also say upward of 90% of the results that you see in facial recognition systems are likely to be false positives. Now, with that said, do we want to enable policing that is already discriminatory to be 99% accurate in the way that it surveils particular communities? Because that's the question on the other side of, well, why don't we make this technology more accurate? And so, we've looked at, as I said before, especially in New York City, the ways in which CCTV cameras that are enabled with facial recognition are configured in space. And if you were to make those technologies 99% accurate, you're not going to be undoing the kind of institutional discriminatory policing and racial targeting that undergirds those systems in the first place. And so going back to what Rachel said before, just to say, we just sort out people, you can't begin to deploy facial recognition systems before you've sorted out law enforcement agencies. And that's a whole other debate. I'm not going to get into revolutionizing or dismantling policing for the time being. But I will move on to sort of the implications for peaceful assembly and expression. Indiscriminate mass surveillance under international law is simply not compatible with the tests that we use to establish what kinds of interventions are okay in accordance with international law, especially tests that we deploy to see whether there's been a legitimate and necessary proportionate violation of a particular human rights. For the context of facial recognition system, we would say that there hasn't yet been a case that has demonstrated necessity, proportionality, and legitimacy in its deployment of facial recognition system. Simply by design, as we've just talked through, it's impossible. And at the point of deployment, it becomes increasingly more difficult as you start to see compounding violations. And we've had a number of rapporteurs, including the special rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, the special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of rights and freedom of opinion, saying that in environments subject to rampant illicit surveillance, the targeted communities know of or suspect such attempts at surveillance, which in turn shapes and restricts their capacity to exercise rights to freedom of expression and association. So again, we have UN experts that are warning us that these systems are incompatible with some of the most basic rights that we need in order to operate as a free society. Going back to the case of the uses of these technology for discriminatory purposes, I want to touch base on the case of Derek Ingram. Derek Ingram is a Black Lives Matter protester who we work with in New York City. He's an organizer that set up a collective called the Warriors in the Garden Collective. In the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, he set out to protest the murder. However, after having participated in the protest, he was met with the New York Police Department at his door, harassing him for 4 hours with no warrants, but simply saying that he had conducted some form of, as it were, illegitimate conduct at the time that he took part in the protest. It later transpired that journalists had caught a printout of a facial recognition report that simply the New York Police Department had just been looking for anyone who had participated in the protest to identify, and they just happened to be able to identify Derek and decided to go harass him. What they subsequently found out was also that the NYPD had charged them with a bogus charge of using a megaphone too close to an officer's ear. Last I checked, that wasn't a crime that warranted a 4-hour harassment outside your door with several police officers and drones buzzing about your apartment. This man ended up, needless to say, fairly traumatized and also in a battle with the New York Police Department, who has since dropped charges but refuses to disclose how it's used facial recognition technologies. We've since sued the NYPD, and they're now giving us that documentation, 250 documents at a time out of 5,000, but we have a long way to go to understanding how they're using these tools, and there isn't transparency in the process of how that procurement happened and whether it's lawful in the first place. Then there's a case study of Hebron and the context of the occupied Palestinian territories. We see how this technology is used, facial recognition in particular, to reinforce arbitrary restrictions on the freedom of movement. So putting aside for the time being what it does to our ability to exercise and protest, what it does to our ability to live freely as racialized people. What happens when people can't move? And Palestinians in Hebron, they have to contend with a facial recognition system being used at their checkpoints from which they move from neighborhoods that are largely residential into areas in which they can access work, groceries, medical services, education. In and around H2 and Hebron, in particular checkpoint 56, which is giving access to a neighborhood called Tel Romeda. There is a facial recognition system that's been deployed that's called the Red Wolf system, which effectively operates a traffic light system that determines to what extent someone is allowed to pass or not, where previously a Palestinian individual might have contended with a soldier being able to identify them and, you know, say, oh, I know this person lives here, so yes, please pass, or no, I don't feel like it today, you can't pass. They now have to contend with an algorithm being able to identify them, first of all, and if it identifies them, making sure that they're not flagged on the database for having participated in an illicit activity, which includes participating in protests, which includes being a part of a human rights defender group, which includes simply having been flagged for anything that the Israeli security forces consider untoward. And that itself might lock you into the actual checkpoint, foreclosing your ability to even going back home, or your ability to leave your neighborhood and access, you know, the goods that you need for the day, or medical services, or we have a number of examples involving ambulances that have been stood out at the checkpoint for hours, waiting to service an ill person who has been stuck at the checkpoint because they couldn't be recognized by the facial recognition system. You know, we have a resident who describes the chilling effect that the surveillance is having on them in Hebron in particular. And they say that those who demonstrate know that even if they don't get detained on the spot, their faces will be captured by the cameras and they can be arrested later. We're told that effectively the ongoing closures that are reinforced by surveillance are killing all forms of social life. That Israeli soldiers can tell you that your name is not in the database, and as simple as that, you're not allowed to pass through to your own house. Moving on from the context of facial recognition slightly and zooming out on the bigger picture. We're all familiar with autonomous weapon systems to some extent. And they're essentially applied AI systems that are often used in military contexts, and increasingly one of the greatest threats to human rights across the globe. And there's never been a more prime time, I think, to turn our attention to the elephant in the room, which is to say, not why responsible AI in the military is important, but perhaps why our attention to their human rights harm is even more crucial, and so their regulation. It's really important that we understand that autonomous weapon systems are not sort of a technology in and of themselves. They're often made up by component technologies that already have compounding human rights costs. So we're talking about remote biometric surveillance technologies such as facial recognition, allegedly gender, age, and sometimes emotion and gait recognition. And as we've discussed, we have unveiled previously that there are exponential human rights harms to communities of color, women of color in particular, associated with the usage of these tools. Other component tools such as predictive analytics have shown damning applications in predictive policing, preemptive gun detection, taser-equipped AI-based drones, to mention a few. And these are all examples of component technologies that make up autonomous weapon systems, which already have massive implications for your right to privacy, equality, non-discrimination, freedom of assembly and expression, and freedom of movement. So think about what would happen if these technologies were all packaged together into one unit. And these technologies don't need to be lethal to cause irreparable human rights harm, right? An autonomous system, swarm, for example, that is entirely non-lethal but immobilizes people and automates surveillance can be both highly oppressive and violate a range of human rights. So technologies that maim or immobilize individuals at different degrees of autonomy should also be keeping us up at night. A few key issues before I wrap up here. These systems often lack context. From remote biometric recognition to predictive analytics, these technologies lack the ability to analyze intentions behind people's actions or make complex decisions about the proportionality or necessity of a particular attack or a particular intervention, be it within policing or in the armed warfare context. Not to mention the need for compassion and empathy for civilians caught up in context of war. It erodes the possibility for dignity, and at worst, it automates death. And it normalizes it as sort of a merely technical undertaking. You killed X number of people who are just casualties of an AI system that we will continuously improve. And so by next year, we should be able to reduce that by another 2%. Meanwhile, thousands of people might still die or be maimed. Then there's a question of meaningful human control. These new weapon systems are at risk of further endangering civilians and civilian infrastructure in conflict, as we've seen more recently. Our concerns are particularly around the human rights risk of increasing autonomy in policing and security equipment, and what it poses to our ability to draw legal red lines around the kinds of practices that are already in place. We're already having trouble as it is to draw red lines around policing practices that are discriminatory, around the rules of armed conflict, let alone to start trying to draw red lines around systems that are being used rapidly without any regulatory framework in the context of warfare. And then there's, of course, the lack of, and Rachel alluded to this as well, the lack of a legally binding instrument, the lack of any form of regulatory framework. Of course, not talking about the EU AI Act here, which is very much in development, but which also has fallen woefully short of the promises that it initially set out. And we need these prohibitions, right? We need these prohibitions to ensure that the burden of evidence to permit the usage of these tools should be on those who use it to prove why they want to use it. And why should it be necessary and proportionate? It shouldn't be on those who have been affected by it to choose that they were harmed, to say, oh, can you guys just stop for a second with the bombing so we can like take a breath before you continue. And maybe we can respect some human rights in the meanwhile. That's not how these systems should work. The onus should be on those who want to deploy it to prove why. And so putting an agenda forward that really thinks about regulation and really thinks about having adequate prohibitions in place, I think requires an enormous pressure from all walks of life, in particular from the scientific community, whose work has already put states and companies on notice. Timothy Brew, I mentioned before, Emily Bender, Margaret Mitchell, and countless critically incisive scientists are asking us to pump the brakes. So if there's one thing I ask you to consider taking away from this conversation, is the two-pronged questions of one, where is the space to stop and consider when something shouldn't be built, rather than assuming inevitability, and working towards adjusting society to the particular intervention in sort of a reverse order, as if it had emerged by some miracle of natural law. There's nothing natural about the emergence of AI systems in these various contexts. We've decided that they should exist. And then two, there's a wonderful quote in Webb Benjamin's recent book on viral justice, in which she encourages us to think about all of our individual plots, the particular aspects of our lives, that is the work, social circles, communities in which we have small but meaningful impact. She says, hands to plow, where's your plot? And so for today, I suppose my question is the same. Hands to plow, where's your plot? How will you ensure that the world moves in the direction of the much needed protections against the automated erosion of our rights? And in what small but meaningful ways can you gear your work towards this? I'll stop there, but thank you so much for making the change.
Thank you so much, Matt, for those comments. Really appreciate it. Now, Tanya Youssef for the campaign to stop killer robots was supposed to be here, but unfortunately, she messaged me last night saying she was unwell, so unfortunately she couldn't make it. We're really lucky because one of the chair of the next session, Dr. Peter Burt from Drone Wars, has at the last minute stepped in, which I'm very grateful for. So Peter's going to talk today about AI and the campaign to stop killer robots. So over to you, Peter. I just say to online people, if you want to post questions in chat, you can do so and I'll check them out. Otherwise, maybe raise hand, but we'll come on to that in a sec. Peter.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone. And as Tim said, apologies from my colleague Tanya, who is indisposed today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the international campaign to killer robots and the organisation that I work for, Drone Wars UK, and the work we're doing to campaign against autonomous weapons systems that Matt was just talking about. Drone Wars UK was set up more than 10 years ago now, back in 2010, by my colleague Chris Cole. At that time, drones were the kind of, scary new creepy military technology that everybody was reading about in the papers, and the media and analysts and the public were, quite worried about their sort of implications. Clearly, things have moved on since then. Drones have become normalised. When Chris set up Drone Wars to scrutinise the use of drones and monitor it and look at what the UK and other armed forces were doing with their drone wars, doing with their drone weapons, then it very soon became apparent that we needed to start looking at other technologies as well, not just drone technologies, but the technologies that kind of enable drones, like surveillance technologies, miniaturization technologies, robotic technologies as well. So we first started working on topics such as artificial intelligence and military artificial intelligence back in around 2018. And we put together this report, and I think there are a couple of copies of this and some of the other papers we put together at the back of the room. Do help yourself. This is called Off the Leash, and it sort of documents at the time, about 5 years ago, what the UK government was doing in terms of using artificial intelligence in its armed drone programs and other military programs. Now, it's kind of interesting that looking back on that report 5 years later, almost everything in it now is out of date, in as much as the projects which at the time were concept projects have now moved forward and become in-service weapon systems, which kind of gives an idea of how quickly things are moving in that realm. As kind of part of that work, we wanted to join the international campaign to stop killer robots, which was kind of set up again about 10, 15 years ago by Human Rights Watch in the States, and is a kind of international coalition, if you like, of non-government organisations concerned about these issues. It's based around an appreciation that as technology is developing and military systems are becoming more automated, then we're coming closer and closer and closer to the point where weapons are able to make a decision to engage a target. So in other words, machines can make a decision to kill somebody without any human agency. And clearly that raises a whole range of ethical and legal and humanitarian challenges, some of which we've already heard about, others which we're going to talk about in the next session. Matt told us a little bit about what we mean by killer robots. What they basically are is weapons which bring together a sensor, so that's something which can kind of collect data from the environment around it, and a computer, so something which can process that data and use it to identify patterns, and in this case, select a target, and then an effector, which in this case is a weapon, which is basically used to destroy something or kill somebody. So there need be no human agency in that process. And the technology exists to do that at the moment in a fairly rough and ready form, although there's some debate as to whether it's actually been deployed yet, because a lot of the weapon systems which we're seeing emerging in Ukraine in particular, in places like Libya and Azerbaijan, and also nowadays, unfortunately, in Palestine, although that technology is becoming more and more automated, there still seems to be a degree of human control in how it's used. So we in the campaign to stop killer robots think there's a need to act now, basically, before it's too late, if we're going to tackle this this problem, because things are obviously moving very quickly. What we think is the way forward is to put together an international binding legal treaty which will ensure that weapon systems always remain under human control, meaningful human control. And we can talk about what that might look like in the question and answer session. What do the governments of the world think about this? And in particular, you know, we're in the UK now. What's the UK government's position? Unsurprisingly, the United Kingdom government is not particularly keen on the idea of a treaty like this. UK governments traditionally have always been very sceptical of anything that will kind of restrict their freedom of movement and their ability to do whatever they want to do, particularly in the military. The UK obviously is also very keen to stick close to what the United States are doing, and the United States has invested a lot of money and effort into autonomous military technologies. So, to say the least, I think what we've seen from the United Kingdom government is foot dragging. But we have had some successes in the campaign work we've been doing. For most of the last year, a select committee in the House of Lords has been looking at the use of artificial intelligence in military systems. And that committee put out its report just before Christmas. Now, clearly, it wasn't what we would have written from our campaign side of things, but given that it was written by, people in the core of the UK's conservative political establishment, it was about as good as it was going to get. The paper was quite critical of Ministry of Defence policy on artificial intelligence, and particularly on its kind of ethics and safeguarding arrangements. It said that the UK should engage much more than it's doing at the moment internationally, and it said that the UK should support some kind of international treaty on the topic. So that's a good step forward. And partly we think because of that report and the work that's been done elsewhere in campaigning, at the end of last year, the UK government was moved to support a resolution in the United Nations General Assembly on autonomous weapon systems. And that resolution said that the UN General Assembly was concerned about the pace of development in the field, and there was an urgent need for the international community to address these challenges. It authorised the Secretary General to go away and consult on what individual member states felt about this issue. And very importantly, it said that the General Assembly should return to this issue again the same time the year after. So it's still on the table. And relatively speaking, that's quite a big win for our campaign. The only states to oppose that motion basically were the Russian bloc. So Russia, Mali, Zimbabwe, Belarus, and also India. Most of the rest of the world supporting it, the obvious people that you might imagine abstaining on the issue. So making it personal, what can we do about this? Well, if you go to the Stop Killer Robots website, you all know how to do that. Then you can find lots of stuff about how you can sign up to various petitions and pledges. There's stuff there about how you can organise your own sort of local meeting, which is great. But, do petitions really change things? I don't think they do personally. So what can we do that might have a bit more impact and sort of take these things a little bit more deeply into the work we're doing? So we all work in policy communities or academic communities. We work with people, we talk to people about these issues. So we can kind of gently challenge them and prod them. We can ask questions about this. They don't need to be confrontational questions, but if in a seminar somebody talks about an application of artificial intelligence, maybe we could say, that's interesting, what might be the kind of ethical implications of that? What ethical screening would be done on that? Or, that sounds good, but it might have a military potential as well. What are you going to do about that? Try to get people thinking about these things and asking some of the questions that Rachel was talking about. Maybe you could do it, but should you do it? I think that's probably enough for me for now. Have you got any questions? You should have.
Thanks everyone. That was really great. I learned a lot. So I've got about 20 minutes for questions. We've got a couple online which I've seen, but maybe I'll start from the floor. So would anyone, if you can raise your hands, I might take a block of 3. And got 1, 2, 3 over here. Anyone from this side of the room? Okay. This side of the room, I'm going to start with this side of the room. Might be some questions, okay? So if you could state your name and then your question, I'll take 3 and then get the audience to respond. So yeah, if you want to go first.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really interesting. I'm Anahita. I'm a policy visit. I might have 2 questions or just 1.
Go on then.
I guess my first question is, I get a sense that a lot of the risks around AI have overlapping intersections with other policy issues, topical discussion, that kind of thing. Do you see the regulatory measures that we have to take, kind of like developing legislation, that kind of thing, to safeguard AI risks, as something that we should be doing like more so on an international scale or like at the national level? And then also, do you see it more as we need to be coming up with new kinds of policy making, like specific to AI, or more like strengthening and updating existing measures and policies that we have in place, like for example, in other areas, like from a warfare perspective, like arms control treaties, that kind of thing, to be updated to like tackle AI as a risk? And then my other question was, I get a sense also that AI is rapidly developing, it's an emerging technology that like we can't necessarily like perfectly predict. Do you see like use in using futures and foresight and forecasting methods for that? And like, do you feel like they could be feasible or reliable? Like, do you think there's a risk of overestimating or underestimating, which is like not being very good? That.
Okay, thanks, Anahita. Someone else was over there, I believe. Yes, you, and then I'll go to you. If you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, thank you for your talk. So, yeah, very interesting. My name is Laura Hunhead. I'm studying cybersecurity, cyber strategy and policy here at King's. And I guess my question would be, as concretely as possible, so what are the sort of high priority, most necessary regulatory the regulations that you would personally support the most? So I don't know, I would like to hear your opinions about standards, regulations, what would you, sort of suggest?
Okay, thank you, Laura, and yeah.
Hi, my name is Ben. My only question is just a simple one. For Matt, you mentioned that we don't know how people are gathering data. Is that right? Sort of naively. But I was just wondering, I'm sure that Amnesty they must have asked, or what attempts have been made to gather it, and what are, I suppose, the companies, what rules are they putting up that are stopping that data being available, or that method of data gathering being found?
Okay, thanks, Ben. So maybe Elena and Rachel, you can start and then move on to Matt. The last question is directed to you, so Elena, would you like?
So when I answer this, just remember I'm a computer scientist, but I also have a second hat. I'm a director of research at a non-for-profit called the Open Data Institute. So I am a little bit involved with policymaking, but I do remain a computer scientist at heart. Hopefully, one that doesn't build everything that could potentially be built. So you probably know what is happening in the regulatory space, right? So we have different approaches in China, in the US, in the UK, in the EU. If you look, for instance, at the White House executive order, right, that was released after the AI Safety Act, what do you see there? You see a very strong focus on national security. You see a classification of these very powerful, what they're called frontier models. So a marketing term for very powerful AI systems that is based on some very specific technical attributes. So the amount of computation it takes to get to that, to train that model. You don't see anything about, say, the data that went into that system and the rights of individual data subjects or creators or others in that data. You don't see anything about any sort of transparency requirements. So you see a concern with national security. At the same time, on a more positive side, and Stanford actually have done a nice analysis, I think, of that, you see some desire to provide the right resources and skills in government to continue to think about these issues. And you also see a will to look at AI across different government departments in the US. And the UK, it's a little bit of the same thing. So you empower existing regulators to think about AI. Now you have the EU AI Act, which is still not yet final. That talks more about general purpose AI and about transparency requirements and distinguishes between models and systems, and also makes some interesting considerations around open sourcing and what it's allowed, what's not. Yeah. So that's a long answer to say there's many different approaches. Do we need an international system? Yes, we need alignment because those systems could be used. They are developed in one part of the world, data is collected in another part, and then they're used somewhere else, right? So we need some sort of international alignment. Will that be easy to achieve? Probably not, right? So I would look at organizations like, or initiatives like the Global Partnership for AI, where there are working groups that are thinking about that, or OECD. Will that stop people from doing bad or just silly things? No. Regulatory measures, you said. Yeah, do we need other instruments? Possibly, because, but at the same time, there have been other technologies that developed very quickly, right? So look at, I would say, let's just try to at least learn from the mistakes we've made with, say, social media platforms, yeah, where we've tried to apply all these different sandboxes and alternative futures and methodologies, but we've still missed the big picture, and we've still allowed for lots of harm to happen. Should I mean, Rachel, you probably have more to say as well.
So I think one of the issues with the approach to regulatory alignment is it tends to be very technically based rather than impact based. And actually one of the things my focus is really on how this is playing out in the UK, where we have a very entrenched approach, which is about risk-based regulating and legislating rather than rights-based. So in the US last year, was it last year or end of 22, there was the London House co-authored a blueprint for an rights-based approach to regulating, which I think is a really positive document and an approach that sets out the kinds of outcomes to protect against. Because if we look at what's happening in the UK now, government are recruiting incredibly specific roles to do auditing, really, right? And the focus on auditing means we're observing the things that are happening now, right? Whereas if we move to rights and outcomes, we're able to ask people not to make those things rather than to try and divert them at the last moment. And I would say, from the work I do in policy here, that the issue is not necessarily we don't have the right instruments, it's that we don't have the right legislators. We don't have people with enough experience and expertise of the issues at hand. We have a lot, both here and in Europe, the corporate lobby is enormous. I can't remember the number offhand, but the amount that Google, Meta, Amazon, Apple spent in Europe last year is much more than any amount of money that went into civil society, you know, and those public affairs operations are incredibly influential. And so I think it's not as much that we need people with the right expertise in forming and making calls, because I think it's over technologized, over corporate, it becomes over complicated. I do work in forecasting, but actually lots of these things are just really obvious, right? We don't have to overthink them. We don't have to go away and write a report for 5 years. We just need to be more confident, more upfront, sort of now. And so, you know, I'm not super hopeful we're gonna, you know, if we get a new government in the UK, I don't think that there is currently enough expertise within Labour to sort of take a strong pivot, but I hope at least it's an opportunity to approach it slightly differently. I don't know.
Thank you, Rachel. Matt, do you want to ask Ben's question?
Yes, so to answer your question directly, Ben,
in terms of data gathering practices, there are two challenges. One is knowing what tool is being used by what company in the first place. And the second question is, how was that particular tool used against a particular community? And whilst we would originally, send pre-note information law requests to the New York Police Department, we would receive rejections that court later on found to be unlawful. We would appeal on several occasions. And what we ended up doing in the absence of having access to data that showed us exactly, the questions that we asked included what software package were you using, where were you targeting protesters, etc. We were able to use GovSpend to establish what possible software suites they may have used. So we know that it could have been DataWorks Plus, it could have been Clearview AI. We're not entirely sure which. We weren't able to gather from their responses where they would have deployed facial recognition technologies, but we were able to use Google Street View imagery to ascertain where NYPD cameras were positioned across the entire New York city. And we actually used 7,500 volunteers to reach an agreement between 3 people for each intersection across New York City about what number of cameras were present as they looked through Google Street View API. And I think we found roughly 25,000 cameras across the whole city. We then looked at previous comments made by the Deputy Commissioner for the New York Police Department's IT department, who had previously said that they have approximately access to 18,000 live streams for facial recognition. And so squaring that with our 25,000 and another Stanford study that did an automated detection of cameras, which had, I think, slightly over counted, but we landed at that number being fairly accurate to at least inform us where these cameras were and how many they were. So with that data, we could go back and sue the NYPD once again on the basis that this was a public interest issue, because clearly too many people across New York City are exposed to facial recognition. We could overlay it with census data to tell us what communities specifically were targeted, which is how we were able to get to the numbers around what communities are targeted. And we also compared it to where stop and frisk happens in New York City, which is how we got to that sort of correlation that I talked about before. I also just want to briefly get back to Anahita's point about forecasting, because I do think one really important thing, and I'm so sorry I'm taking liberties here, Jen. One really important thing that we should be talking about and thinking about in this space is how so much of our imagination and opportunity to forecast has been captured by corporations, and they are shaping so much about how we think about what AI is for and what tech is for. They will tell us about the metaverse and why we should be excited about it, even though it died last year. They will tell us about how generative AI are going to write our essays and are going to replace our admin staff. They will tell us about futures that are 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead. And when it comes to AI ethicists, when it comes to human rights practitioners, when it comes to, even activists that are, frankly, to be fair, putting out too many fires to be able to think about what the future looks like, that is an alternative. We're not taking enough time to think about, what do we imagine a different tech future to look like. So so far as forecasting is relevant to the question of what possible new political imaginations can there be in this currently techno-dystopian moment, I think we need to have that conversation. I'll leave that there.
Thank you very much. So we've had a few questions online with regards to military drones, Peter. So if you don't mind, I'm going to collate them and direct them to you. Is that okay? Yeah. And maybe Matt can chime in as well, because I think it might be a crossover. So Julia asks, how do these drones work on the battlefield in Ukraine, and how are they regulated by international law? And do they pose a real risk to the rules and principles of arms conflict law? And then Akopi Ajanye, I hope I'm saying that right, say, do autonomous technologies really possess the potential to revolutionize military capabilities, or are we exaggerating the battlefield advantage they carry? And what type of regulation do you think would you ideally like to see around autonomous weapon systems, both in terms of research and use? I know that's a lot, but maybe just provide an initial thought on some of those questions.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Matt can add if you'd like to. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, questioners. First question was, how are automated weapon systems working in Ukraine and how they're regulated? Well, we know that increasingly autonomous weapons are being used on the battlefield in Ukraine by both sides, by both Russia and Ukraine. We know that drones have received a lot of media coverage, both in terms of the larger sort of industrial built drones that are being used again by both sides in the conflicts. And again, with the smaller kind of hobbyist type drones that you can go and buy in somewhere like JB Sports or whatever, or you can buy online and then you can then send to somebody in Ukraine. You can then use it for, you know, spotting where enemy force locations are. Whether or not those drones are autonomous in the true sense, whether there is a human controlling them or not, it is a moot point. We don't think we're there yet, because certainly the less sophisticated off-the-shelf drones don't have that capacity. The more sophisticated military drones, depends whether or not you believe the manufacturer's claims or not. And as you know, manufacturers' claims are often inflated, and we think that although it might be possible to modify some of these drones so that they could operate autonomously, in fact, the majority, if not all of them, are being operated with some kind of human controller for at least some of the kind of functions that are involved. What we are seeing, though, is very much a trend towards more use of autonomous systems and automated technology on the battlefield. That's a trend which has been sort of increasing quite a lot over the past decade or so. And our concern is that that will kind of increase to the point at which systems do, before too long, become fully automated. In terms of regulation, if you speak to a military person, they'll tell you that battlefields are some of the most regulated places in the world, but the regulations are set by people who have a vested interest in them, the military. So they're based around basically the rules of engagement that the commanders are set at a sort of political senior military level. We don't know what they are, and to whether or not they would allow the use of a fully autonomous weapons system or not. There's a question about how the principles of international humanitarian law would apply to autonomous weapons systems. I'm not going to say a great deal about that because we have a paper coming up on that in the next session, which I think will perhaps talk about some of these issues. Other than to say, as we've heard from Elena, these systems, you know, they don't think, they don't rationalize, they're not intelligent in the way that, you know, we understand intelligence. You know, it's just statistics. It's just a machine processing data. So a machine cannot possibly engage with any of the kind of very complex contextual ethical decisions about whether, you know, a decision to kill somebody is justified or not under international humanitarian law. There was a question about, you know, why are these systems used? What are the advantages of them? Well, the advantages as far as the practitioners are concerned, military and industry, is basically they save time. You know, the responses on the automated electronic level are much quicker than a human level response. So, you know, those microseconds can be important on the battlefield. They save costs and they free up personnel for other tasks, and they take military personnel out of, you know, the direct conflict situation and put a machine there instead. Those may or may not make sense from the military point of view, but there are other costs. And the main one of those costs is that they transfer the burden of risks to civilians. There is not a human looking at the machine to say, is that a civilian or not? Is that person a legitimate target? The decision is made by a machine. So that raises all kinds of issues about transferring risks and accountability and things like that. Finally, in terms of regulation and international regulations, as I've said, the Campaign to Stop Killer Robots is looking for a binding international treaty on that. What we think would be the best kind of treaty would be something which, firstly, would place a ban on the use of a computer system to identify and kill people who are targets, because that raises all kinds of pitfalls about, you know, what are the characteristics on which you're kind of choosing your target? Is it skin color? You know, is it whether they're carrying a rifle or stick or what? And there are all kinds of scopes for kind of, you know, error and misinterpretation there, regardless of even bigger ethical issues. So that's a no-no. Clearly, we would like to ban any system that we can't understand. So any, if you like, any black box system that is not going to give a predictable or consistent answer. You know, we don't want anything that might go wrong or come up with something that we can't be sure is going to do what we want it to do. So systems like that should be banned. And then anything else, any other weapon should be subject to some kind of meaningful human control. A human should be meaningfully able to sort of direct what it does and make the key targeting decisions. And on top of that, all the existing obligations that apply to weapon systems and the military under international humanitarian law, all of those obligations, they should be kind of positively reinforced. So that's what we're kind of looking for on the international level. And that's a treaty which is not technology specific, which I think is quite an advantage. And it means that we can sort of future-proof it in that sense. So apologies that was rather a long-winded answer.
No, no,
It's
perfect.
covered all the bases.
Thank you. Matt, did you want to add anything on the international? No, thank you. Do any of the panelists have any further thoughts? Otherwise, I might wrap on this session. Thank you so much to the panelists.